Have you ever bought something on an impulse buy for no real reason, then afterwards you're like, why the hell did I even buy that in the first place? You then set it aside in the closet or something for it to just collect dust and not get any use, and then one day you stumble upon it and say, oh, I remember this. You know what? I actually need it for something. Well, hopefully, that's going to be the story that we have today. Hey everyone, this is John from EastCoastArmory.com, and I'm here today with a model showcase video for this 1/35th scale German Hummel SPG. The model in this video is built for my own personal collection and is not for sale and or purchase. However, like I often mention in these videos, I frequently take on commission build projects from models ranging between 1/35th scale and 1/6 scale. For availability and pricing information, that would be best by contacting me through the email address listed below, which is info@EastCoastArmory.com. This model here is built predominantly out of the box. However, I did go ahead and make one major modification to it. We'll be going over the modification, the basic build, as well as giving the model a thorough in-box review. So stay tuned because there's going to be a lot of content coming right at you. To start this video off, let's go ahead and take a quick walk around this model. And this vehicle here is the SDKFZ 165 Hummel. The Hummel was a German World War II SPG that was developed off of the Panzer IV chassis. This vehicle came into being in about 1942, where the purpose was that the Wehrmacht needed some kind of a mobile self-propelled artillery to keep up with their vehicles. Prior to this, there were some vehicles similar in format to the Hummel. However, since they were based on smaller chassis type vehicles, the armament was going to be severely limited. And in order to mount a real heavy main armament to the vehicle, a larger chassis was going to need to be utilized. For the Hummel's main chassis, it was decided to go with the Panzer IV. Originally, the Panzer III was going to be utilized. However, it was realized that the Panzer III was not going to be suitable with taking the weight of the main armament that was envisioned for this vehicle. The Panzer IV, on the other hand, was a better choice. The use of a Panzer IV for the main chassis was actually a wise one because at this time, the Panzer IV was in full production and all of the bugs were worked out of this system. Another benefit is because this vehicle does have cross-compatibility with standard Panzer IVs, finding replacement parts and keeping the vehicles maintained was also easier and was less of a strain for the maintenance department, as well as also even supply. These shared components did not end with the suspension and the running gear, but it also continued with the engine and transmission. This vehicle utilized the exact same Maybach HL120 TRM V12 gasoline engine as the Panzer IV family. The vehicle's main armament would consist of a single 15cm SFH 18/1 L30 Howitzer. The vehicle was going to have its ammunition as a two-part system, which is quite typical for armament of this caliber. For secondary armament, the vehicle would have utilized a single MG34 MG. Being an SPG, this vehicle was never intended to engage other enemy armor directly, so the secondary armament was predominantly used as a self-defense weapon. The vehicle was armored, however the armor protection was a bit thin because again, it's not really meant to be used in combat. The vehicle's armor protection consists of about 10 to 30 millimeters of steel armor plate, and the vehicle had an open-top casemate design, which was typical to other vehicles of this type of class that the Germans utilized during this period. These vehicles were accepted and adopted by the Wehrmacht in 1943, and production continued all throughout to the war's end. Approximately 714 of these units were produced, so it's actually a pretty decent number. This particular example here is an initial production variant, which differs from the later production units in a few key areas, namely with the position of the driver, as well as also with the layout of the exhaust manifold. The vehicle weighed in at 24 tons and could hit a max speed of about 26 miles an hour. This, of course, is keeping up with the other vehicles of the period, specifically the ones that were being used by the Germans. The vehicle had a crew of 6, which would include a single driver, and the remaining crew would handle the main armament. The one critique that many of the generals had for this vehicle was with its ammunition capacity. The vehicle can hold about 18 rounds of ammo, which was deemed to be a bit on the lighter end. In order to remedy this, an accompanying vehicle was also developed, which would contain only the ammunition. This vehicle would ride along with the artillery battalion in order to keep all of these vehicles sustained for long durations of time. This tactic is still done today and can be seen with the US Army with the M109 Paladin, as well as also its dedicated ammunition carrier. One last thing to mention about the Bumblebee, which is the English translation for the German word Hummel, is that this pattern of vehicle was what Alket used to create the Nashorn tank destroyer. The Nashorn is the Hummel's brother, and basically the two vehicles are identical with the exception of some modifications that the Nashorn had to the fighting compartment area, where the Howitzer was replaced with a high-velocity anti-tank gun. The Hummel was utilized on both eastern and western fronts. Currently today there are 6 known examples of this pattern of vehicle in several museums across the world. One of which, namely the example in Munster, Germany, is fully operational and is still in running condition. Before we go any further with the video, let's go ahead and take a step back to when this model was first started in order to get a good idea on what the base starter kit supplies you with. And here's the model at the start of the build. For the base starter kit, I'll be utilizing this Dragon 1/35 scale Hummel self-propelled gun. Specifically, this is their initial version that was released back in 2003. Of course, anyone who's an armor modeler will tell you that Dragon is probably one of the biggest names in the armor modeling racket. They've been doing this now continuously since about the early 1990s timeframe, and since then, every so often, Dragon goes ahead and retools and re-releases vehicle types that they've already done in the past. Sometimes this is to their detriment and can lead to some boring type announcements like yet another Panther or yet another Tiger. However, this is for some pretty good reasons by and large. You see, Dragon first released their 1/35 scale Nashorn tank destroyer. In fact, I actually did a model showcase video on one of those early kits and can be found on the channel. Shortly after the release of that kit there, Dragon went ahead and tooled up a Hummel. The Hummel was an all injection molded plastic kit and recycled many of the same components from the Nashorn kit that I just mentioned. Both of those kits were very successful, and as time went on, Dragon would revisit them from time to time, improving the tooling on them and giving them some better, more accurate details. On top of that, Dragon would also go ahead and fill in the missing gaps in the vehicle's family tree, like with this version that we have right here. You see, the other version of the Hummel was a later production version, while this one here represents the initial production version of this vehicle. This kit here was released by Dragon back in 2003, and basically was just yet another addition to their ever-expanding 1/35 scale 39-45 lineup. Just like I stated in the pre-video bumper, this was something that I purchased really as an impulse. This model here I purchased shortly after the release of this kit here. It was about 2004 or 2005 or so. I was perusing through my Squadron mail order supplement that came in the mail, and sometimes it pays to look through those because in the one section towards the end, they basically have like a everything must go sale, and in that listing was this particular kit here. This kit here normally retailed for about 35, maybe 40 US dollars at the time, and for one reason or another, Squadron was dumping them for about 10 or 15 bucks a pop. So obviously it was an extremely good deal, and even I couldn't pass it up. Like I already stated, I wasn't really interested in purchasing this kit. This was not something that I was actively looking for, and basically it just fell into my lap. Another thing to point out was at this time in my life, I wasn't building or buying any 1/35 scale model kits. At this time, I was specifically focusing all my effort and time developing detail components and working on models in 1/6 scale. So this one here was definitely something that just literally fell in my lap. Keep in mind, it's a Dragon kit. It's a Hummel, which is not exactly something that I particularly, had to have. And because it's a Dragon kit, I know that Dragon kits have individual link and link tracks, so that was definitely going to be something that normally would turn me off. But again, for the price that they were releasing these kits for, I literally couldn't say no. So I purchased the model, it came in, I popped open the box, just peeked through the runners for a little while, and then everything went back into the box, sealed it up, and it went back into the stash, and there it literally sat until basically today when I'm filming this video. As for the models themselves, they are all injection molded plastic. I'm not sure if this one might have any photo etch pieces on it or whatever. We'll see once I crack the box open. Around this time, Dragon was really starting to supply kits with these aftermarket accessories, like things like basic PE, metal turnings, things along those lines, but again, I'm not really sure if this has that. We're going to find out once I crack the box open. They were very easily obtainable. These kits had a very good distribution, and like I stated before, at the time they retailed for anywhere between $30 to $40, and today you could still find them on eBay and possibly also on some other online retailers, and generally they're going to have a price that basically has stayed the same since then. This is also the type of kit that you'll find stashed away in a hobby shop somewhere, or possibly you might encounter one at a swap meet or a model show type setting. Starting with the model's graphic design, well, first let me just go ahead and finally get all this crap off of the top of the box. Like I stated before, this thing was sitting in a pile for a number of years, over 10 to be specific, and starting with the box art here we have the Hummel, paired up with another one side by side, and at this time Dragon was utilizing this illustrator for their box arts. It's different compared to some of the other artists they've had in the past, like Ronald Volstead or Vince, and I'm not really sure who did this one, but it's a different art style altogether. It's more of a painterly relief, and it's not as photorealistic as some of the other artworks that are done on the, or I should say, done by the other illustrators that Dragon hires generally. Having said that though, the illustration is still decently rendered. You can see all the details found on the Hummel in the foreground as well as the one in the background. Background itself is a nice peaceful setting. It's not like it's a action scene or anything. And it's just two self-propelled guns just sitting in a field. The remainder of the typography is typical for Dragon. Of course, this is part of their 135, 39 to 45 series. There's the Dragon logo. The box is pretty thick. It does have a lot of parts on the inside, which we will see once I crack it open. On the side panel over here, we have a thumbnail of one of their retooled Nashorn kits that was also re-released around this time. Some verbiage, as well as the copyright info. Of course, the date is 2003. Side panel here, typical for the 39 to 45 series. We have a thumbnail of the illustration, the green side panel with the information that I touched on before. Of course, this is kit number 6150, in case anyone was curious about that. And on the other panel over here, we have some quick little thumbnails of the built model in question. Cracking open the box to reveal the contents. Not even going to dignify that with a response. Okay, so digging through takes us to first the suspension. Because this here is one of the later generation of Dragon kits, all of the tooling is 100% Dragon and is not based on any of the earlier tooling, which was originally has its roots with the Italeri kits. All of the plastic is molded with this current generation Dragon plastic. If anyone has built any of the newer and older kits, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. The components are very nicely detailed. Note the leaf springs here found on the Panzer IV suspension, as well as on the wheels themselves. The hubcaps are a separate detail piece that gets glued on, which is a nice touch and nice feature. Here you can see the final drives along with the sprocket and the rear idler wheels. If I'm not mistaken, I believe these runners here are actually recycled from several other renditions of the Dragon 135th scale Panzer IV kits. In fact, yes, it is. Here we have, it's from the 135th scale Jagd Panzer, which, by the way, I've built, and I actually have a video showcase of that model on the channel as well. The next runner contains a fret of figures. This is something that is fairly unique for Dragon kits. On the Tamiya kits, for instance, you generally have a couple figures that are supplied as standard, but on Dragon kits, this is not necessarily done. Generally, on Dragon kits, the figures are part of a special re-release type issue, as opposed to their general issued kits like we have with this one. The quality on the figures are pretty good. However, I believe that these might be recycled from the Nashorn kit, and I say that because of the shells that are contained on the runner. However, these figures are not going to be used on this build because building and painting figures is not something that I do. So these are going to be relegated to the spare figure bin. Well, I might as well throw this out there. If anybody is interested in these figures here or any of the other multitude of figures that I have loitering around, Feel free to email me through the email address info@eastcoastarmory.com, and for like $5 plus shipping, you can have this runner sent off to you. Of course, first come, first serve, but just throwing that out there. The next runner contains what appears to be a replacement set of sprockets. The sprockets that are found on the other runners are the later pattern of Panzer IV sprockets, which you can see right here. And this one here has the other options, which would be present for an earlier version of this vehicle. Note, we do have two types of options available. We have the one with the perforation holes, and then we have the other style, which came afterward. The pieces are very nicely detailed, which is, again, what we would expect on a Dragon kit. Next runner looks like it consists of some more goodies. We have here late pattern rear idlers. I'm not sure if those are going to be used. Knowing Dragon kits from this era, they started just throwing tons and tons and tons of runners at you that were recycled from other kits in order for you to use maybe one or two parts from it. So chances are really good you're going to have a ton of spare parts left over on this one, which is not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, spare parts are great because you never know when they might help you on a rainy day. So these pieces, again, nice tooling, which is typical for Dragon kits of this era. I see some rear fenders that we have here, and the details, again, are pretty good. So let's carry on. The next runner consists of most of the fighting compartment equipment. We have here the chassis mount, the rear fighting compartment floorboards, as well as some other components for the casemate design, the actual gun shield, and this appears to be for the Hummel because we actually have the Hummel ammunition rack as opposed to the Nashorns, which are slightly different in shape. Note, on the runner we have the detailing for the optic. As you can see, it's a very nicely, intricately molded piece. Digging down further takes us to this runner here, which appears to be recycled from the Nashorn. The reason why I say that is because of the front shield. But again, I wouldn't be surprised that there are a good number of components that are found on this runner here, which are going to come in handy. Here we have the exhaust manifolds, and on this one here, they are drilled out. This was something that was absent on the older first generation kits, and if we can recall from that video, I actually have to drill them out with a Dremel or a pin vise. With this later production kit here, that doesn't seem to be the case. On the very bottom, looks like we have a runner that was removed from its bag for one reason or another. But this runner here consists of the casemate panels. Here we have the armored sections. Note, on the interior portion here, we do have some interior detailing, which is very nice. It consists of its rigidity bulkheads as well as all the other provisions for mounting on the interior components. Same is also true for the rear section. And we have the front portion here of the bow. Moving down further takes us to the Howitzer. Pretty typical for one of these kits. This model does have a two-piece barrel assembly, which is, again, very typical for plastic model tank kits in general. We also have the carriage and the cradle, and all of these components appear to be extremely well detailed for the medium. On the very bottom of the box, we have the lower hull. Note that this is all 100% new tooling, and it isn't borrowing any other parts from other previous generation kits. If we compare this to the Nashorn, I believe that lower hull was a standard Panzer IV hull that you had to go ahead and lengthen by adding a piece to the rear section. On this one, that's not the case. The hull is all 100% original tooling for a Hummel and or Nashorn. The quality is very nicely detailed. It has all of its fender rigidity supports that are integrally molded on, not to mention all the underhull details complete with axis panels as well as fastener detailing. On the inside portion here of the bag, we have some more parts, namely a small little run here consisting of World War II German small arms. We have a 98K Mauser, a G43, two MP40s, and a Panzerfaust for good measure. Pieces look to be really nicely detailed, and we'll see what they look like as the video progresses. Also on the bottom here, we have some photo etch, which is a very nice touch, and we'll see how that pans out, again, as the build goes on. Furthermore, you can see a small little set of water slide decals. In the past, Dragon water slide decals have always been pretty good in quality, so I'm expecting similar results on this one here. On the bottom of the box takes us to the instructions, and this is something that is very unique on this kit, and it's really on this kit alone. I've never really seen this type of layout done on other Dragon kits, both that came before and after this. Unlike typical Dragon kits where they're just basic CAD drawings, or in some case even drafted drawings, on this one here it's full color, and they're actually, I think, real photographs. First, we can see the runner layout, and of course, you're going to have a lot of grayed out areas that are not going to be used and are going to languish away in the spare bin, but again, that comes with the territory. But on the inside here, that does not look like a set of Dragon instructions that you typically see. They actually use what appears to be real photographs of the model being built. I don't think these are CAD files. If they are, they're really well done with the way they colored them in. And I believe this is, again, something that, if anyone has seen this on other kits, let me know in the comments section, because, again, of all the Dragon kits I've ever built, this is the only time I've ever actually witnessed this. It's, other than that, the details, or I should say the layout, is very similar to what you see on general instructions, but again, with this format, it's really nicely done. It's a nice little departure. Looks to be a fairly straightforward assembly, but again, of course, like I always state in these videos, if there's any snafu or typos found in the instructions, I'll be sure to point them out. The color chart looks pretty good, and by the way, the instructions does have a little bit of water damage on it, and there was a small little overflow one time, and this box did take the brunt of it, but as you can see, it held up okay. But on the back portion here, you get to see photographs of the actual 1/35 scale models that, like this one here, is used on the side panel, and this one here looks like another nice little rendition that they made. Overall, I'm actually kind of glad I bought this kit, and it's going to be, it looks like so far it's going to make for a very interesting build. However, the instructions are not the only bit of literature. We also have here a little index card type sheet that contains the instructions how to assemble and how to paint the figures that are supplied with this kit. The illustration is actually from Ronald Volstead, and again, it's a very typical Ronald Volstead type artwork, which means it's very nicely rendered. However, the in-box review isn't done just yet. You see, just like what was showcased before, the model originally came with individual link and link track. Obviously, those are not going to be utilized on this build and are going to languish away in the spare parts bin where they belong. Actually, they belong in the trash, but this spare parts bin is a nice secondary dungeon for them. In its place, at one time, I was going to utilize a set of single-piece vinyl tracks like we see here. These are a set from Italeri. They were purchased off of eBay many moons ago, along with several other single-piece vinyl tracks, some of which have already been showcased on this channel on other builds, but this one here was added to this box many years ago, basically on the fly, because, you know, it's a Panzer IV based vehicle, these tracks should be fine. Well, to some people's amusement out there, that's not going to be the case. These tracks are not going to be utilized on this kit because these tracks here are too short for a Hummel. The Hummel has a slightly stretched out hull, and because of that, a standard set of Panzer IV tracks are not going to fit. So because of that, these tracks here are not going to be used on this build. However, don't shed any tears because these tracks will indeed be making an appearance on this channel in another video down the road where they will indeed save a Dragon 1/35 scale Panzer IV base model from the dreaded doom, which is the individual link and link track. So more information on that is to come. However, for this build here, I'm going to be utilizing a set of workable metal track links from Fruli model. These are the same tracks that I touched upon in the Nashorn video for the exact same reasons. In that video, I mentioned that these tracks were fantastic quality and are highly recommended, and for this build here, nothing has changed. However, there are some quirks to utilizing Fruli model tracks. First is availability and cost. The tracks themselves I purchased from Fruli model themselves off of their website, and if anyone has ever used their website before, the ordering system is a bit archaic to say the least. However, if you follow the instructions, they pan out every single time. The tracks themselves are also a bit costly. In most cases, they cost as much or sometimes more than the base starter kit in question, and that's definitely the case for this one here. But again, you're getting what you pay for. The tracks are really nicely done and nicely molded. The other thing to point out about the tracks is that the material that they are molded in is a lead-based alloy. This may be problematic to some users. When you're assembling these tracks, you want to constantly wash your hands, wash your equipment, and make sure you're work area is nice and clean, just to mitigate any chances of any lead exposure. Also, if you have kids, obviously you want to keep these far out of the reach of them. And here's the model going through its course of assembly. These open casemate self-propelled gun type vehicles are slightly different with their construction compared to your standard exterior tank model kit. These vehicles are similar along the lines to what you would expect to see on something with a full interior detailing. And what I mean by that is that when you're going through a build like this, you can't just go through the assembly and then paint everything at the tail end of the build and expect some really good results. These models are more or less like the interior tanks, like I mentioned, where you really need to build the interior first prior to focusing on the remainder of the external detailing. And of course, this isn't just true for the Hummel, but it's also true for all the other vehicles with a similar type setup. This would include the Nashorn, the Dicker Max, the Martyrs, the Sturher Emil, and then on the Allied side you would have vehicles like the Priest, the Sexton, the Archer, and even the Su-76. You know, those are just a few that come to mind. Regardless of what they are, you basically have to undertake the build in a similar way to what I'm doing here with the Hummel. As you can see, the model is far from being completed, but I focus a lot of the paint work and the weathering work at this time on the fighting compartment interior detailing. You see, once the casemate gets installed, getting access to paint and weather all of the details found on the inside here becomes very problematic, if not impossible. So it's best done while the model is going through its construction phase, and we're at the point that we have here. On the interior itself, the kit's interior is very, very nicely done and is very well engineered. The components just drop into their appropriate locations without any problems. But one thing I do want to point out is that at this point here, I've already mounted on most of the detail components because, well, at this point, the sides are ready for installation. During the painting and weathering aspect of the build here, the ammunition racks, as well as the ammunition boxes, were not mounted at the model at this time. However, the remainder of the bulkheads and some of the other basic details were. The reason why these pieces are painted separately is because of the extra locations that you see on them. Trying to get paint into some of these nooks and crannies is going to be very difficult, if not impossible, when they are mounted to the model. This is specifically true for the propellant case that we have here on the right-hand side. The rear sections of the shells are integrally molded in the stowed positions found on the cabinet and are nicely molded out of the box. However, you, the builder, are responsible for painting each and every one of these pieces, and it is a bit of a meticulous procedure. The pieces are nicely rendered so that they stick up past the shelf, so painting them is fairly easily done, but it's one of those things you really have to take your time with, and you make sure that the paint is at the proper consistency. If it's too thin, it's just going to bleed and run all over the place, making a mess, and if it's too thick, it's going to be too chunky, and it's also not going to do you any favors. These little straps that you see here are mounted on after the brass sections are fully painted. Obviously, this type of procedure needs to be done prior to the piece being installed or even having these little straps fitted in place, which is why, again, I can't stress this enough, you need to paint and weather everything separate prior to the installation onto the vehicle. There is an option, by the way, in case you don't have the skill or the tooling to paint all these little pieces, where we have the cabinet doors fitted in place, and that is an easy way out in case you don't want to sit there with a little paintbrush and painting all those little brass end connectors. So they do have a life preserver for you in case you want to go that route. The remainder of the interior detailing is, again, very nicely done, but there's one thing I do want to point out, and you do have to pay attention to some of the intersections. Like, for instance, there are these portions that get glued to the side hull here, and this is true on both sides. With the way the kit is designed, you actually have a L and R indication for left and right hand use, but what's interesting is that they have the L and R molded on the exterior portion of the panel. Because of this, when you're going through your build, you're going to have to remove that little bit of molded on instruction in order to improve the look of your model. Otherwise, it's going to look a little weird and it's going to throw off the immersion if you have a nice little L and R molded into the side of your hull plates. Another thing to point out is that on this portion here of the sponson, there's a small little groove that's integrally molded on. This is undoubtedly used for other versions of both the Hummel or the Nashorn. However, on this particular kit here, that section is not necessary, so I went ahead and deleted with a little bit of red putty, and I just sanded it flush to the condition that you see it here. The same is true for a few other locations found on the sponsons, but this is more true for the side plates that are found on either side. There are several equipment mounting locations that are present on all the sections on the interior, and not all of them are going to be utilized on this particular kit build. So because of that, it would behoove you to just polish those sections away, which will improve the look of your model. Along those lines, there are several knockout marks found on the sections of the fighting compartment, as well as also on the rear portion here of the lower hull. These are easily polished away with a little bit of super glue or red putty, and then some fine sandpaper finishes off the job. You do have to be careful though on the fighting compartment sections because of the proximity of these knockout marks. Some of them are close to some molded in bulkhead details, and to be best, you really want to take your time, otherwise you run the risk of removing too much molded in detailing that's found on these sections. On this build, fortunately, I did not have any problems with any collateral damage from the sanding procedure. Back to the lower hull sections, one thing I want to point out is how well the kit is engineered by Dragon. You'll notice that there are several bulkheads that I went ahead and glued onto the hull prior to the fitting of the side sections. And with the way the kit is designed, it is so precisely engineered that you can just mount these in the kit allocated locations, and they will line up absolutely perfectly with the side sections. There are no other hand fitting or other sorts of tweaks that are necessary in order to get the pieces to fit on in the appropriate way. Everything literally just lines up. If I just go ahead and illustrate this, you can see without any work whatsoever, everything lines up where they need to go. On some of the molded in sections, there are bulkheads or bulkhead receptacles that are integrally molded in, and as you can see, they just line up absolutely perfectly, which is a testament to how well this kit is engineered. I also want to take this time to point out that the Howitzer is going through its construction as well, and the piece was pre-painted prior to the assembly of the carriage, as well as the main barrel section being mounted in place. This is because obviously there are a lot of nooks and crannies found on this section here, and it's best to paint everything as separate sub-assemblies as opposed to assembling it in this configuration and hoping for the best, thinking that paint should get into where it needs to go. The Howitzer itself is also one of the last things to be mounted to this vehicle. In fact, it's probably the very last thing to be mounted to this vehicle. This is because when the unit is mounted in place, specifically with all the superstructure fitted, trying to mask up and protect these areas here while you're going through the remainder of the base coat and the camo and weathering is going to be very problematic. It's best done with everything off of the model so I could thoroughly paint and weather the unit accordingly. And also, with the fighting compartment, I need to thoroughly mask up all of these open areas in order to prevent any sort of paint bleeding from the remainder of the paintwork. And it's really this aspect of the build with the masking which differentiates it from its interior tank kit counterparts. With those models there, you still have to mask them up, but generally you're just masking up hatch locations and engine hatch inlets, while on a vehicle like this, you have an entire superstructure to thoroughly mask up in order to protect it from the remainder of the paintwork. So in that regard, they do require a little bit more prep work by the builder, as opposed to the other vehicles that I just mentioned. One other detailing that I'm going to be securing to the model at this point are some German small arms. The kit does have several provisions for mounting 2 MP40s as well as also 2 rifles. The components are supplied with the kit that I touched upon earlier in the unboxing. The components themselves paint and weather very nicely. Starting with the MP40s, you'll note that the magazines were cut off of them, which is something that was requested to be done by the instructions. But when it comes time for painting them, I went ahead and did something a little bit different that most of the time would not really be seen or that noticeable once the model is fully painted and weathered. And that has to do with the material that the fork stocks are made of. On the MP40, the lower portion is actually made from Bakelite, and on this model here, I went ahead and modeled it in 2 different formats. The one on the bottom is standard black Bakelite, while the one on the top, the Bakelite, has a reddish tint. This is something that was seen on several real renditions of these submachine guns during World War II. In order to achieve this effect, the only thing that I did was on the one on the bottom, I used gloss black for the appropriate locations, and on the one on top, I used Tamiya Hull red with a little drop of some clear gloss lacquer, just to give you that Bakelite sheen. Directly on top of it, you'll see a G43 rifle. The piece was just, again, painted and weathered to the condition that you see it here. This set also gave you a very nicely done 98K carbine, but unfortunately, when I had the piece in the tweezer, when I was about to paint it, of course, in typical fashion, it flung off to Lost Partia, and sadly, the piece is forever gone. So on this one here, I'm only going to have one rifle stowed in the rack. However, keep in mind, with the way the kit is designed, you're not actually requested to put any sort of rifles on the racks, and you're supposed to leave them totally vacant. So at least one is better than nothing. Starting with the model's running gear, all of the components that you see here, sans the tracks, are stock with the kit and were assembled out of the box. The components received no modifications whatsoever. The pieces I found to be very nicely engineered and were extremely detailed. The undercarriage is very nicely rendered out, where we have the bump stops, the fasteners on the bogie housings, as well as also the various access plates that would be present on the real vehicle. The idlers also go together very well, and the sprockets, like I touched upon before, are nice that the kit gives you two options. I went with the early perforated pattern, but they have the traditional Panzer IV pattern sprocket as well. One thing that I like about the way this particular kit, or really this generation of Dragon Panzer III, Panzer IV kits were designed, is with the way the sprocket secures to the final drive. On the earlier examples from Dragon, the final drive had this little nub sticking out and the sprocket was to be glued to it. This one here, the piece was redesigned where we have an actual stem emerging from the final drive, and the stem is long, but it's also fairly chunky. Because of this, this makes for a really strong and robust mounting point. This is really appreciated, specifically when you need to fit on the aftermarket track. On earlier examples of the Panzer IV kits that I've built in the past, I've had to modify the way the sprockets secure to the final drives with drilling out the center portions of the final drives as well as the center portions of the sprocket and having a metal rod inside in order to give a little bit more material and more strength for the sprocket to fit onto the housing and hold up the weight of the aftermarket track. With this one here, that wasn't necessary. You just build it directly out of the box and the track goes on as it would on the real vehicle. Hopping to the track itself, as I touched upon before, there was no way I was going to use those individual Lincoln Lane tracks. So these were replaced with the aftermarket metal workable tracks from Fruley. The Fruley tracks, like I've mentioned in the Nashorn video, are very nicely done and are highly recommended for the stock tracks that come with the kit. They go together very easily and once assembled have some excellent detail on them, but they also have some really nice sag that's built into the tracks. When mounting these tracks on, the idlers I actually leave off until the final point of installation, and this is done so that when the tracks get fitted to the vehicle, I can actually add a drop of glue on the adjustable idler mount and set the track tension to where it needs to be. This is one tip that I recommend on a few of these vehicles that have a similar type setup, and it's one that usually yields from some really good results. Back to the tracks themselves, you'll see that they have the hollow guide horn, which of course is more than appropriate for this pattern of vehicle. As I've stated before, these tracks are excellent. They hinge together pretty easily, and once you have your rhythm down, within no time you'll have enough track to assemble one whole vehicle, and even some spares that I have right here on the front. They do give you sufficient spares, so if you botch up a link or two, you do have some extras to offset those mistakes. The Fruley tracks, as nice as they are, they do have some shortcomings to them. The first disadvantage is their material. These are made out of a lead-based alloy, like I may have touched upon before. This may be a problem for some individuals out there for one reason or another, but probably the biggest hurdle that the Fruley tracks have is their cost. They tend to be quite costly, retailing anywhere between $35 to $40 plus shipping. So this is something that may be a problem for some individuals out there, specifically if they're working on a budget. Fortunately, there are several options out there for aftermarket workable Panzer III and Panzer IV pattern track. In fact, they're probably one of the most common. And they come in a multitude of different materials, from injection molded plastic to cast resin to other types of metal. One option that I believe is noteworthy is the set from Ryefield. I used them on another Panzer III pattern vehicle that I built in the past, and those tracks were nicely detailed. They were also very affordable. However, I'm not sure if they give you enough links in order to build a Hummel or a Nashorn. Because of the extended hulls found on this pattern of vehicle, this may lead an issue with the number of track links that are supplied with this set. But with some of those tracks being as affordable as they are, you just simply buy 2 sets and, build accordingly. But that's if it even comes to that. I believe the Ryefield may give you enough links to equip one of these stretched out hull vehicles, but again, I'm not really sure, and I'm basically assuming here. But this is something that could be looked into if the builder chooses to do so. Regardless, if you are going to build one of these kits, by all means, get the aftermarket tracks. They are far superior than anything that you can accomplish with individual link and length. From the tracks brings us to the rear hull area. Starting with the exhaust manifold, this one is a very unique version of the Hummel in that it has the type of exhaust manifold that runs along the side portion of the hull and sponson, then it goosenecks and snakes into a standard Panzer IV type exhaust manifold. I believe this is something that was more commonly seen on the earlier patterns of both the Nashorn and the Hummel. And it's really cool that Dragon went with this type of version. The components assemble very well, and they go together pretty easily. On the exhaust manifold itself, there are some seams to contend with the way the molds are designed and how the pieces get assembled. However, the seams polish away pretty easily, and once done, leave for a very nicely detailed unit. Directly beside the manifold, we can see the German rear convoy light. This is your tubular tail light, which is found on a large number of German World War II based vehicles. The tail light itself is adequately detailed. The only thing you need to do to enhance it is to properly paint it. This is one of those little bits of detailing that is commonly overlooked on a lot of builds that I've seen out there on the internet. The piece is painted with a enamel paint from Testers. It's their gloss blue, I believe. It's one of the ones generally found in the model car aisle, but I'm not even sure if those paints are still in production. But regardless, the Testers enamel blue, it's a fantastic color for these German World War II vehicles. Just a simple little swipe, and you're good to go. The rear plate does have several other details found, namely little guards, struts that hold up the exhaust, and so on. These bits of detailing are supplied with the model, but are very finely molded, and it's really easy to break these pieces off or possibly damage them during the extraction from the sprue. This is one of those type of things where you want to take your time and have some patience and care for, and if you do it properly, you shouldn't have any problems. Which, by the way, this is going to be a running theme in this video, specifically when I move up to the superstructure detailing. But before we do that, you can see here the ranging poles directly over the exhaust manifold. This being a self-propelled artillery piece, you are going to have ranging poles that are going to be stowed somewhere on this vehicle. On this version of the Hummel, they're located right here on the rear plate. The ranging poles are very nicely detailed, but you have to properly paint them. This is, again, one of those details that is commonly mistaken for something else. I've seen some builds out there where they presume that these pieces here are the gun cleaning staves, which look very similar in appearance. However, they are for 2 completely different applications. The ranging poles do have this intricate candy cane type paintwork found on them for a very important reason. In order to highlight them, you just simply paint them in the following manner. The pieces are red, and in the appropriate locations, a stripe of white paint is applied. On the end sections, these would plug into the ground, so they are silver in color, and again, just a simple swipe of the appropriate paint is all that you really need to do in order to make the parts shine. One thing that this kit did a little bit differently compared to some of the other kits out there that have a similar type of feature is that generally on some of the other kits, the points that are attached to the vehicle where the rods connect to are generally molded onto the rods themselves in one segment. However, on this model here, it's a little bit more in depth where each of these pieces are separate finely molded sections that need to be removed off the sprue, cleaned and then secured to the rear plate. Again, you want to take your time because if one of these pieces flings off the lost partia, you're going to be screwed. Moving to the front of the vehicle, we see a lot of details that are found. Pretty much with the exception of the spare track, the remaining details found here are all stock. And again, just like with the pieces I just mentioned, are all finely molded, and care needs to be exhibited on all of them in order to just remove them off the sprue and fit them to the vehicle. Here we have the front travel lock, which you'll notice is in its collapsed state. This model does have the option to render it either in the deployed or the collapsed state that you see here. The choice, of course, is up to you. Unlike some models, namely the Nashorn, where the piece was actually functional or semi-functional, this one here, that's not really the case, and it's really meant to be one or the other. Moving a little lower, it takes to the spare track rack. The rack itself is the kit supply one, and the Fruly links just slid directly into place with no problems whatsoever. Moving topside brings it to the front plate, starting with the headlights. These are a multi-component piece, as I touched upon before, and once properly assembled, give for some excellent results. There is no need to replace these with any type of aftermarket part for one reason or another. They are good to go out of the box as is. One cool thing about this kit, as opposed to some of the other Panzer IV pounder vehicles I've built around, is that this one actually gives you the electrical conduit that connects to the headlight and mounts into the hull. On some earlier renditions of the Dragon kits, as well as just some other kits on the market, this bit of detailing is generally omitted, and this is something that would have to be scratchable by the builder, either with a piece of wire or something similar. Some kits, they have the little receptacle molded into the top deck, and again, you just take a little piece of wire and connect the two. On this kit here, that's not the case, and you could simply just build it out of the box and have the appropriate detailing. Along this portion of the fender, you can see the jack block, which is excellently detailed. It's complete with the rigidity straps, the fasteners, as well as even the lock bar with the wing nut on it. Again, very well thought out on Dragon's behalf. Directly behind it is the antenna base. The antenna on this model I left in the off position, and I'll touch upon that once I get to the inside. But here you get to see what it looks like with the antenna removed. Of course, on German tanks, as I often mentioned, the antenna bases are made out of rubber so that they are flexible, and the top nut portion here would be brass. Of course, if you paint the component with the appropriate colors, no other work needs to be done by the builder. And when you're done with it, it leaves for some very good results. The final bits of detailing I do want to point out on the front hull area are all the little lift hooks that are found in these locations. These, of course, are separate molded pieces, and again, it's another one of those bits of detailing on this kit that you want to watch out for because of the frailness and the propensity for these things to go flinging off on you. Moving towards the side takes us to probably one of my favorite aspects of the Hummel Nashorn based vehicles, and that's these shark grill things that we have right here on the side. Of course, these are the intakes for the engine, but they are nicely detailed on this kit regardless. The detailing is a mirror image on the opposite side, and again, they're just nicely rendered. Some of the other detailing found on the fighting compartment would include the fasteners along the top, as well as little tie-down straps for the tarpaulin that are found on the various locations on the sides, as also on the rear. As I mentioned earlier, these are, again, one of those little fiddly bits that are easily lost. Fortunately, they are easily replaced or fabricated out of a thin piece of wire if the need be arises. But I will say this, if you lose one of them, you might as well scrap them all and replace all of them with metal just to keep continuity. While on this area here takes us to the rear doors, the fit on these parts were excellent. The detailing on them is also pretty good, but again, very frail, which we'll see once I pan to the inside. But it's just something I briefly wanted to touch upon. With the camera readjusted, here you get to really appreciate the detailing found on the inside. Of course, I touched upon this earlier in the video, but now that everything's fully assembled, you get to see what the final outcome of that looks like. With the model fully assembled, you could really appreciate why I mentioned before it's best to build, paint, and weather everything prior to final installation, as trying to get in here to do all those techniques is basically almost impossible. And once it's fully assembled, it really yields for some excellent results. Briefly, like I may have mentioned earlier, but here you get to see the antenna stowed on the inside of the vehicle, and this is why I did not try to drill out the antenna stub and use a wire like I generally do on these builds. So if I would have done that, it actually would have been a mistake. The inside really is probably the shining hallmark on this entire kit. Specifically, you really appreciate it if you've built or handled one of the older generation Dragon kits. Again, that old Nashorn from the mid or the early 90s comes to mind. If you stack these two side by side, even though they're completely different vehicles, oof, you could really see that Dragon stepped up their game quite a bit. Back on the outside of the vehicle takes us to the main armament. Now the Howitzer on the real vehicle, of course, can elevate and pivot. However, on this model here, that's just not really the case. So for this one, I just left it in the static position that you see here, and I enabled the travel lock found on the back. The piece itself, however, again, I cannot stress enough how nicely detailed everything is, and more important than just having nice details on it, it fits together extremely well. There are some older kits out there where you're going to have to do a little bit of fiddling in order to get the shield and the casemate to fit properly, but with this one, that wasn't the case. It went together like a dream. Because of the way the kit's assembled, you are going to have a lot of two-piece assemblies that you're going to have to deal with the recuperators, the barrel, and even with the main cradle. But once the bodywork is completed and everything is sanded down and it's nice and flush, it yields for some excellent results. The last thing I want to mention on the exterior involves the spare wheels that are found quite notably right here on the side portion. The wheels were probably the last bit of detailing installed on this model, and the reason why that's the case is with the way they are shaped, you're not going to be able to fit the wheels in with the pieces fully assembled. If you note, if you try to take the one from the bottom here out, it's going to be impossible to do so. So this is something that you pre-assemble prior to the pieces getting fitted in place. You paint them separately, you weather them separately, then when it comes time for final installation, everything will blend right in, and it will make for a nice clean install. And that's really it for the detailing on the model itself. This, of course, leads us to the paint and the marking. So the model is painted with a three-tone German camouflage pattern, quite typical for the usual paint jobs I do on this channel. For this one, I went with an ambush type paint scheme, and the paint job itself was heavily inspired by the real surviving Hummel that's in the Munster Tank Museum in Germany. The ambush pattern on this is a little bit differently from what I can remember. I went with a broken ambush where rather than having the ambush dots littered all over the vehicle, it's only on a few certain types of colors. So you'll see on the green ribbons, you'll see yellow dots, and on the red blotches, you'll see green dots. Again, there's a multitude of different ways to do an ambush pattern, and each of them look good in their own right. And for this one, I thought it would be appropriate to go with this type of a version compared to some of the others that I've done in the past. The markings that you see on the model are the Kit Supply water slide decals, and they are excellent. They went on with absolutely no problems whatsoever, and it was a dream. The pieces slid off the wet paper without any snagging. They were able to secure to the side of the vehicle without any sort of blistering or silvering. And most importantly, they were able to be sealed onto the model via the VMS varnish with absolutely no traces or any other types of imperfections. If all models had this quality of decals, I would be a very happy camper. For weathering, I went with the techniques that I've mentioned on a number of the videos that are posted on this channel, and it's a mix of airbrushing as well as dry brushing. Some of the airbrushing techniques would include shading, fading, filtering, as well as a wash here or there for good measure. The dry brush is just one color that's dry brushed to get the highlights on the surface areas, giving you the look that you see here. In the end, I'm really happy in how this one turned out. This was one of those shelf queens that was sitting in the stash for a decade way too long, but actually it's kind of a good thing because if I would have built this model all those years ago, I doubt it very much it would have turned out as good as you see it here, and it would probably be a contestant for the OTR video lineup. And I'm pretty sure there's going to be a few OTR fans that are bummed out about that, but this is one vehicle that I really didn't want to have to do a rebuild on due to the full interior, so it's good that the chips fell as they did. And if you are an OTR video fans, don't worry, I got a ton of models that are already done, they just need to be filmed in the lineup, so stay tuned for that. But back to this one here. Yeah, I'm really happy on the final outcome of this build. Pivoting to skill level and recommendation, first off the bat, if you are a beginner or a novice builder and are looking to dive into a model for the first time or second or even third time, this is most certainly, absolutely, definitively not going to be the kit to do so. This is an advanced model kit, and you will be required to have some advanced skills and experience when working on a kit like this in order to just build it out of the box. This model here is really best suited for an individual who already has a number of builds under their belt, and these builds also include several builds that are similar in nature, where you have a lot of complex sub-assemblies that all assemble together, giving you for the final outcome and detailing. If you do not have experience with working on a kit like that, this kit here is definitely something to postpone or possibly look past. If, however, you do have those type of skill sets, basically at this point you're a intermediate to an advanced range builder, to which then the doors open up, and this build here is actually highly recommended. The quality of the kit is excellent, and specifically with the way the interior detailing is rendered out, this model here is a very nice example of the Hummel. There are a few other options out there from various other companies. Tamiya and AFV Club come to mind. However, I haven't worked on one of those models in comparison, so I can't really comment on how they compare and contrast. But I will say, after working on this one here, this kit is definitely something to look into if you want to add a Hummel to your collection. If you are also an advanced range builder, you're probably going to want to further enhance the detailing found on these stock components. Although, in my opinion, the stock detailed parts are exquisitely made, there is always going to be some room for improvement. And with a Hummel, I'm pretty sure out there's going to be a photo etch conversion or an upgrade set to take this model and punt it even further with the level of quality that the model has in it. Although, in my opinion, again, I don't really think it's that necessary. Dragon really did a pretty thorough job with the interior and the external detailing on this one, so unless you really have something special in mind for it, this is really a kit where you can just build it out of the box and just, enjoy it as is. But there's always that one individual out there that likes to pursue things even further. If that's you, this build here is a fantastic starting point in order to carry it further. And of course, I am going to throw in the obligatory asterisk of notifying everyone, if you are going to go ahead and build one of these kits, for heaven's sakes, swap out the tracks. In my opinion, the replacement of the tracks is absolutely mandatory, and it's well worth the investment. The stock kit has such excellent quality on it. However, because it has the individual Lincoln Lang tracks, it really is an eyesore found on this model. By swapping those out, it's a great way to not only make the build 10 times easier to build, but it also improves the detailing tenfold. The workable tracks always improve models, and on this one here, it's definitely no exception. For track types, like I've touched upon before, there are several different options out there on the marketplace. I went with Frulies on this one here, which are, again, highly recommended, but there are a few other options available from some other companies. The list is so long, honestly, it's hard to name them all. But needless to say, that's great for the consumer, because if you are looking for a Hummel, a Panzer IV based track set is very easily obtained from a multitude of different options. So that is, a benefit of a vehicle of this type. But regardless, whatever track system you use, as long as it's not individual Lincoln length, your build will definitely look better in the long run. Which, if I'm not mistaken, I believe we just segued into recommendations. And on top of what I just mentioned earlier, this model here is definitely highly recommended to anyone who's an avid fan of German World War II armor, or basically just World War II armor in general. If you're the type of person that really digs the Panzer IV or vehicles based on the Panzer IV platform, this particular kit here is a definite recommend for that type of individual. The vehicle will also fit into a collection of anyone who is a fan of the open casemate tank destroyer and self-propelled artillery type vehicles, such as the Marder, the Nashorn, the Wesp, and so on and so forth. This model here would be a great addition to add to that vehicle lineup. Obviously, if you dig dioramas, I cannot recommend this vehicle enough because of its open nature. This really gives the vehicle a lot of focal points, and if you're clever with how you arrange your setup with the figures and with the scene, you can get some really cool results and very interesting outcomes if you're going with a vehicle like this. And with the quality that I've already mentioned that this kit has, it definitely would enhance any type of diorama setting. And that doesn't necessarily stop with people who are just fans of German vehicles. If you're a fan of just artillery vehicles in general, this kit here is another recommend for you. If you're the type of person that has the M109, the M107, the M40, the M7 Priest, the Hummel, needless to say, would easily fit into that collection pretty well too. And with that, that wraps up this model showcase video for this 1/35th scale Hummel SPG. If you like this video, be sure to subscribe to this channel where it's a great way to keep up to date on new posted content, being model showcase videos like this one over here, or the other larger project update videos that frequently get posted to this channel. Another way to keep in loop of new posted content is by liking us on Facebook. There I have more photographs of this particular model, as well as the other smaller and larger scale builds that have been showcased on this channel in the past. Furthermore, don't forget to swing by eastcoastarmory.com for more 1/6 and 1/16 scale builds and detail components. Thanks again, and I'll be seeing you all again on the next one. Till then.